go to Phil, and I think it's really timely in this discussion to actually take Phil here, because we've talked, both Jean and Chabri talked a lot about the recruitment process. We talked about competition in the recruitment process. We've talked about exploitation and deceit that happens in the recruitment process. Phil, through your work with IOM and focus on recruitment, what is being done and what can be done to promote safe and ethical recruitment?
Yeah, thanks, Rula, and thank you and the organizers of this session for the opportunity to speak today. It's a pleasure, it's an honor to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about, I guess, from IOM's perspective, but also a little bit about IOM programming in this regard. And thanks also for this specific question. I think I'll frame my remarks maybe around three issues. The first two responding directly to your question, and then the third perhaps pointing in directions of the future, as Jean and Chabri have themselves already done. The first, I think I'll come to the question of the private sector's role in some of this work. It hasn't really yet been touched upon, but as Chabri has indicated, of course, quite a lot of work is being done in that space. I think there's lots that we can talk about. I'll try to see the glass as half full in this case, but I will also make sure to really focus in on some of the challenges and weaknesses of approaches in that context. I'll also talk a little bit about what governments are doing and what more they could be doing, but nevertheless, some of the encouraging signs, at least in the direction of travel currently, although that shouldn't make us complacent. And then, as I said, perhaps a few remarks to finish off, just to give an indication of perhaps where we need to go to fill some of the existing gaps. So what's the private sector doing, just to respond to some of the steps that can be done? I think from my perspective, and you indicated in my own initial biography that I come to the role here at IOM with some experience working in a supply chains context, working for a nonprofit called Verite prior to that with the ILO, always focused on what the business community is doing or should be doing, and what's happening in the supply chains context. And what I can say from those years of experience is that indeed quite a lot has been done, particularly led in the context of supply chains by global brands. I would say stretching already back to some of the initial steps being taken on these issues maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 15 to 20 in any case, although very initial steps at that time. And of course, a lot of experience has gone into now where we are today. Certainly, I'm sure many of the colleagues on the call today will be aware of the global commitments that some global companies have made, primarily in the consumer product space. So the clothes that we wear, the smartphones that we have, and the computers that we're using today, a lot of the commitments from global companies have come from those sectors, to a certain extent also from agriculture, although that's a little bit less. And I think all of those are encouraging steps. Of course, they're not typically framed in the context of Objective 6 of the GCM, because many of these steps predate the GCM, but nevertheless with a very, very strong focus on fair and ethical recruitment, with, of course, the entry point for most of these companies being the risk to brand reputation and the risk to legal challenges and the scrutiny faced of their supply chains by investigative reporters, by civil society, by the labor movement, by others indeed, over conditions related to risks of forced labor and human trafficking. So really the impetus being those very dire circumstances and forms of exploitation, but very much leading companies to talk now much more comfortably in the last few years about labor migration, about gaps in labor migration governance, and specifically about fair and ethical recruitment, which I think are good, well, let's say steps in the right direction. Now, to talk a little bit less rosy a picture, I think it's also very, very important, and I flagged this a little bit already, to acknowledge that while these steps have been encouraging, nevertheless, we see massive gaps. While a lot of this work has been done and pioneered by the private sector in the consumer industries that I've already mentioned, there are many, many, of course, other industries that are completely absent from supply chain strategies and approaches. Agriculture is only just beginning to come online. Construction, there are maybe one or two global construction companies that are looking at migrant workers, particularly in the context of Qatar and other countries in the GCC. But from a global perspective, certainly not enough companies that are really taking a deep dive on these issues. I think also completely absent from these conversations are steps within a supply chain, not to get too technical here in the conversation, but typically the engagement or the areas of engagement are within the first level of supply chain. So let's say the business that sells the final smartphone to a global brand, all of the other components that go into that smartphone, those subcontractors or sub-suppliers are almost completely absent from global compliance systems within global companies, and that's a massive gap. Likewise, and this is where I'll end in terms of the private sector engagement piece, almost completely absent from the conversation is, of course, the production for domestic markets. So that part of the economy, which in the vast majority of cases and economies around the world, companies that are producing not for the global economy or not for global brands, but indeed for local markets, are completely absent from the private sector strategies and approaches. And I think that's a massive gap. Let me move on to some of the steps that governments are taking just to shine a positive light on some of the developments of recent years. I started in a way with the comments or with my intervention focused on the private sector, just to tip my hat a little bit to the pioneering work that has been done in that context. What I would say is that the governments, at least in my experience, are a little bit later to the party on this focus of fair and ethical recruitment. While of course there have been steps taken in recent years to focus, for example, on licensing procedures, or to look at the role of labor attachés and labor inspectorates, there's been much less concerted, robust, systematic engagement on these fronts vis-a-vis fair and ethical recruitment. Nevertheless, I would say in the last 2 to 3 years, there has been growing effort in that regard. And I think the GCM is a perfect example of a platform that provides us for a way to engage governments across all of the important aspects related to fair and ethical recruitment, and the steps and the strategies that governments can utilize to push forward and actually lead to impact on the ground. I think where we've seen the most exciting or interesting work is really some of those that I've already flagged. The role of labor inspection cannot be underestimated here. The role of licensing authorities in the oversight and enforcement related to recruiters themselves. We have to look very deeply at those licensing regimes to ensure the adequate coverage and protection of migrant workers. The role of labor attachés, I think, has been theorized or conceptualized, discussed vis-a-vis labor migration broadly, but what role can labor attachés play specifically as it relates to fair and ethical recruitment, I think is something that we can all perhaps put much more attention on. One resource that I'd like to flag, and Shabri did not flag it from the ILO side, but the general principles and operational guidelines on fair recruitment are an absolutely fundamental document that I think we all collectively need to use as a reference point. Building on that work, IOM released in June this year a document called the Montreal Recommendations on Recruitment, a roadmap towards better recruitment regulation. And I think that's something else that collectively between the two documents, there's a lot that we can draw on in pushing governments in the right direction to tackle these issues. Now, let me end with some very brief remarks. Again, not wanting to see the glass only as half full, but also acknowledging that we have still quite a long way to go. I've already flagged a little bit in the supply chains context some of the gaps in terms of different sectors of the economy, the domestic production issue, some of the gaps in terms of supply chains themselves. I think it's absolutely essential, and I think we'll hear from colleagues as this conversation goes forward, that irregular migrants and migrants that are in the informal economy are absolutely vital in this conversation, and the current strategies, from my perspective, are not covering those adequately, particularly those in the informal economy. And as many speakers have already indicated, COVID-19 has really exacerbated or really highlighted those weaknesses and gaps. And I think it's an absolute urgency from our side that we tackle the formalization of the economy and bringing the regularization of migrants into that. I think as well, we need to globalize this engagement. This is my final comment. What we've seen in the, let's say, the fair and ethical recruitment agenda in recent years, so much work has been undertaken very, very positively and constructively in the Asia-Pacific region. Much less has been pioneered in other parts of the world. So we're putting a lot of effort into looking at Latin America, for example, and also Sub-Saharan Africa. So really targeting West Africa, West and Central Africa, Eastern Horn of Africa, and Southern Africa as well, looking at conditions in each of those regions, just so that we ensure, as we take GCM Objective 6 forward, that it's a truly global agenda and global phenomenon. Thank you so much, Rula, for the opportunity to talk, and happy to answer any questions as the conversation goes forward.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Philip. And it's really amazing to hear you speak about how the private sector is in one way or another kind of has been the easier to engage, as opposed to the governments who have come late to this. And I think I would want to follow up with you specifically on COVID, on what's been happening on COVID, especially with recruitment having virtually stopped, and how does this industry recover and under which standards. But before I do that, and thank you very much for really bringing up the issue of irregular workers, because I think this is one of the gaps that we often overlook.